Hi, welcome to the Car Chat podcast. I'm Sam Moores, and with us this week we have Dave Twohig. Sorry, I'm reading what you've written as opposed to what I have written down. But yes, hello, welcome.
Hi, Sam. Dave or David, doesn't matter. We'll probably stick with Dave. It's easier for you. So yeah,
Yeah,
pleasure to be with you. Long-term fan and
yeah.
listener of the podcast. So it's a bit weird to be on this side of the desk.
Yeah, it's we've sort of communicated on and off for a while over sort of like various platforms. So it's quite cool to get you here and have a. I think I'm looking forward to having a good old chat. Can you tell the audience a little bit about sort of who you are, what you do?
Yeah. Two words, Sam. I'm an automotive engineer. So a lifelong automotive engineer. Spent most of my career working for some of the big companies, Nissan, Renault, etc. Also work for Alpine, very proud of that. I'm sure it will come up sometime in the conversation. And these days I work, rather than for the big companies, I'm a freelance engineer. I like to think of myself as a gun for hire, working quite a bit in electric vehicles, autonomous driving, and still keeping my hand in sports cars now and again. So yeah, two words, automotive engineer.
Nice. Loads of different avenues. So okay, let's take this back. It's back to sort of the start or early days. How did you get into this? Where did it go? Let's tell me.
Oh, I feel this is probably going to be the most boring bit. Folks are going to fast forward this on the pod because it's such a stereotypical story, really, and so many of your guests have had the same story. So, kind of just picked it up as a kid from my dad. I had a car mad father, and some of my earliest memories are lying with him underneath some kind of rusty, oily Ford Cortina, passing him various spanners as he tried to repair the thing before going to work. So yeah, my dad was a car nut, and my brother is as well, my whole family. So I kind of picked it up really, really young, like many of your guests.
Yeah, yeah. And then so what made you decide? Whether I presume you went and studied engineering at some point. Is that something you sort of immediately were like, I want to go end up in cars or not?
Yeah, it was really. I was trying to remember, when I kind of decided, but I couldn't even put a date on it. But I suppose my dad, in some ways, going back to him again, he was a sort of, would have loved to be an engineer. But at the time, education was expensive, etc. He never got a chance to kind of, do the studies, etc., required to get the piece of paper. So when I grew up and had a chance to do it, it was a bit of a no-brainer. So as far as I know, from as young as I can remember, I've always wanted to design cars. I will admit to a slight loss of the faith when I was about 15. I desperately wanted to be a fighter pilot. I was probably overly influenced by Top Gun at the time, but quickly realized that being born in Ireland is not the greatest place in the world if you want to be a fighter pilot. So I kind of switched back to the whole car engineering thing. Thought it was a bit more realistic.
Nice. And then, so what did you study? Did you study mechanical engineering or automotive engineering or something?
I didn't. No, I went to university years and years ago. This was kind of the late 80s, back in the dark ages. But even then, I kind of figured out that, electrical and electronic stuff was going to be really, really important. You could see that even at the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
So I thought, hey, there's going to be a bunch of mechanical engineers out there. So maybe to get noticed, if I study electrical and electronic subjects, I might have a chance of, eventually landing a job. So I studied electrical and electronics engineering, and with hindsight, it was a great choice. This was many, many decades before electric vehicles, etc. But knowing that the red wire connects to the red wire and the black wire connects to the black wire, that's been a bit of an advantage to my career.
Yeah. Nice. And then, okay, so you went to uni, studied electrical engineering, and then where did you go from there?
Yeah, I should probably have mentioned I went to uni in Ireland, actually, back in my home country. So, got the piece of paper, and honestly, I was not that I didn't enjoy my uni years, they were great, but I was just desperate to get stuck in, get into the car industry somehow. So I think I probably applied to every car company in the UK. Being in Ireland, there wasn't any sort of homegrown car industry back then. There still isn't very much, actually. So the obvious move was, come across to the UK. pestered every car company in the country, probably with application forms, CVs, all of that good stuff. And I was really lucky. I managed to get job offers from Ford, the good old Blue Oval down in Essex. But also, I got a job
Yeah.
offer from what was then a kind of a small company. It was a company called Nissan European Technology Center. So a little engineering shop that Nissan had just set up in Cranfield, halfway between Bedford and Milton Keynes, there about an hour north of London. And I was absolutely over the moon. So I got that job, and that was back in 1992. So 30 years ago, I'm embarrassed to say.
And what were you doing? What did that look like, and what were you working on at that time?
Yeah, pure new boy grunt work. Went behind the ear engineer, starting from the bottom. But it was a really interesting time to do that because this it sounds like ancient history now, but Nissan was kind of on a roll in Europe back then because this was when the Japanese car makers, notably Nissan, kind of decided to make a serious assault on the European car industry. And we're talking about the time when there were still import quotas, you had to fulfill local content rules to be able to sell cars in Europe without tariffs. So it was a little bit like, companies like Hyundai Kia did 10 or 15 years later, really coming from nowhere. So the company was really small. It was a couple of hundred engineers, some experienced folks that Nissan had hired from the likes of Jaguar, Ford, Rover, and then a bunch of new grunts like myself. And I was put to work at the bottom. I started in chassis design, started designing little brackets for ABS cables and putting little sensors on the rear axle of Primeras and Micras and things like that. So, it's not glamorous. Your first few years are, okay, here's a drawing, change that by 1.5 millimeter. But I loved it from day one. I was 22. I was absorbing stuff like a sponge and fell hook, line, and sinker for it.
Yeah, that's in. And then, so you're doing various little things, working on all these little projects and whatnot. And then, how did it evolve? How did you sort of progress? I feel like you stayed with Nissan for quite a while.
Yeah, I stayed with Nissan for over 13 years, and the car industry back then, and still to some extent, there's no shortcuts. There's no way you can suddenly become an expert in the space of 2 years. And I explain this now even to young folks coming into the industry. It's a little bit depressing in some ways because the product development cycles are so long. It takes 4 or 5 years to develop a car. To get good at it, you
Yeah.
need to do two cars. So you're already 8 years in. So basically, it's a pretty long process. You need to be pretty patient. So I had a fairly typical career path. I started designing little bits, little brackets, little switches. Then, my bosses gave me responsibility for maybe a system or a module. And then you get a part of a car. And then you work your way up the ladder and you get responsibility for maybe a minor facelift, or do the left-hand drive version of this car, which already exists in right-hand drive. And finally, if you hang in there all this time, the big day comes where the company will say, "Hey, you, Dave, okay, you're ready for the big time. We'll give you a whole car." And that job, the job of kind of being the chief engineer for an entire car, it's got different titles. Every OEM uses a different title. Ford calls it a vehicle line director. Nissan calls it a chief vehicle engineer. Other companies call it program director. But anyway, that's kind of what
Yeah.
you're aiming at the day when someone kind of gives you the keys and says, "Okay, you get to do this car." And that took me 13 years. I took everything I've just described in a couple of minutes. That was 13 years of learning the craft, really.
Yeah, and then presumably, as you work up those different stages, you end up with people underneath you, and then a larger team underneath you, and then does it just get bigger and bigger and bigger until you've got a massive amount of people when you're doing say like line director or something?
Yeah, exactly. So, I remember the very first team I had working for me after a few years, I was working in electrical testing the electronic systems, electromagnetic compatibility, all that good stuff. And, my first job, I had 7 folks working for me. And I want to apologize to any of those 7 who are still listening to us now because I was terrible at it. I had no idea what I was doing. I learned by making all the management mistakes you could imagine to do. But manage to not get sacked somehow, and then next thing you're managing a department maybe of 30 or 40 people, and slowly, as you said, Sam, it builds up like that, until, when you're managing the team responsible for let's say a mass production car, right? A car that's going to be built in, hundreds of thousands or millions of examples. The typical size of a development team on those will be anywhere between 500 to 1,000 people. So, you're managing reasonably big groups of people. If you think about it in the army, I often try to imagine it, 1,000 people in the army is a battalion. So you're kind of leading a battalion into battle. That's the way to think about it in a kind of perverse way.
Nice. And then, so you then are you spending a significant amount of your time just managing people, as opposed to like, how does that work in terms of, you're like, okay, I'm in charge of the car, but actually I need to make sure that person's doing their job, that person's doing it. How does that sort of split out and work?
Yeah. And you've just touched on the kind of career dilemma for most engineers. I can't speak for other industries, but certainly in the automotive industry. Yeah, as your career progresses, obviously you're managing more people, and you've got less time yourself to kind of get in touch with the technical detail and follow all the technical detail. And if you try to micromanage the technical detail, guess what? You're not managing the people properly. And on the other side, if you spend all of your time managing the human beings, which is kind of what your heart tells you to do, you're probably going to miss some technical detail and you're going to make some mistakes. You're constantly trying to balance those two. I personally found, because later on in my career, I got further promotions and was leading really, really big teams of people. I personally found that job of being responsible for one vehicle, not for 5 or 6 vehicles, but for one specific vehicle, that was the perfect balance for me, because you're still intimately involved with the technical detail of every part of the car. You're still an engineer, but you also have the kind of the sort of energy and power of several hundred people who are going to work with you. So that to me was the perfect sweet spot, where you're still an engineer, but you're able to leverage the intellectual power, not just of yourself as an engineer, or 4 or 5 other folks, but 500 or 600 people. And that, when you get that right, it's fantastic. That feeling of kind of balancing the two. It's very rare and it's very hard to do, but I've had it a few times in my career. I've been very lucky.
Yeah, it sounds like I guess you should sort of get to this point where you're delegating all of the technical sort of thought work type stuff, but you can get involved in. You can go, okay, give me your 3 solutions for this problem, and then you discuss it with everyone or whatever. Like, you can dip in, get a lot of like mental stimulation, and then leave the legwork to other people and teams and whatnot.
Yes and no, and this is don't get me started on this, because we could blow an hour of the podcast just on this. But it's a fascinating area, and I've often used the sort of T, if you can imagine a letter T analogy. So when you're managing an entire vehicle, you can't just concentrate on the vertical leg of the T, right? So if you get down and dirty on every technical detail of the car, you're just going to blow your mind. There's too much detail. You're going to micromanage it. You're going to do all of those faults. So you have to have the understanding of the horizontal bit of the T. You need to be able to understand design. You need to be able to understand manufacture. You need to be able to understand chassis. You need to be able to understand electrical stuff. But here's the thing. When something goes wrong, and you sense that, okay, this thing smells kind of fishy. And by the way, that's another skill you have to develop. You have to develop the nose to be able to smell something that doesn't smell quite right. You have to have the ability to carrot down. You have to have the ability to dive down. And you can't just delegate that. And if you do try to delegate it, and if the engineers around you see that, actually you don't have the technical depth to deep dive with them, basically that you're bullshitting, they can smell that immediately. So you need that ability. When there's something going wrong and something threatens the project, you need to be able to put away your manager's hat, put on your engineer's hat, and go down as deep as you need to be able to do. And the folks who are good at this are the folks that are able to balance the kind of vertical engineering understanding, with the sort of ability to the big picture ability, and you're constantly trying to balance those two things as well. And it takes a couple of projects to get this right.
Yeah, that sounds. I mean, that I think a lot of companies and stuff, not necessarily car companies, but you come across it in various industries where you see people leading projects, or but who don't actually have the full experience to be able to dive into what they're doing in all of the details. They're like a bit wishy-washy. I mean, you see this in politics all the time, but they just don't understand the nuts and bolts at the very bottom, and then things start to deviate over time.
Yeah, and that, honestly, you cannot get away with that in automotive engineering. Once again, I can't speak for other fields, but automotive engineers will smell that out. They will smell you faking it and pretending to know what you're talking about. They will smell that a mile off. So that's fatal. You will have no credibility if you try to do that. It's not an area where you can fake it till you make it. Not with the folks working for you.
Yeah.
You might be able to do that a little bit with the press. I'll respect you, Sam, and journalists and podcasters. You might be able to kind of BS your way through something. But if you're in a technical review with your engineers and you're doing the tooling launch for that particular system tomorrow, you can't fake it. You can't pretend to know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean that sounds logical. Everyone knows what they're talking about, so you need to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, see ya. So what cars? I feel like over your time. So you worked at Nissan, and what vehicles were you dealing with at Nissan?
Oh man, a whole long line. I won't bore you with the whole product lineup of Nissan in the 90s and early 2000s, but basically I worked on all of them. From things that I'd rather forget, like the Almira Chino, oh my God, to actually quite fun little cars like all those Micras that you still see running around, all those K10, K11 Micras. All of those, basically. Anything that came out of the doors of the Nissan Sunderland plant or the Nissan Barcelona plant in those years, I worked on. Until, the car that I'm kind of proudest of, and I guess has my fingerprints all over it, is the first generation Nissan Qashqai that came out in 2007. So that was the first car where Nissan kind of said, okay, this guy Twohig, he's been working in the trenches pretty well. He hasn't screwed up too badly. Let's give him a car and see what he can do. And that was the Nissan Qashqai.
I remember. I've not owned a Nissan Qashqai, but I remember them being quite popular. Like when they came out, I think they were quite a few. I saw quite a few around, and I know a few people that had them, and I was sort of slightly surprised. I mean, I knew nothing about them, but it was this sort of car that had slightly come out of nowhere. On that project, or what were some things that were like difficult or unexpected? Give me some nerdy engineering-y or even high-level stuff of putting together a project like that.
Just before I nerd you out completely, yeah, you're right. Your memory is correct. Qashqai did kind of come out of nowhere in 2007 because there weren't any sort of comparable small crossovers, SUVs, whatever label you want to use. So it wasn't a category that existed. And yeah, it was an absolute smash hit. People are maybe not aware of just how successful the car is. But it sold 3.7 million cars and climbing. The vast majority of those built in Britain.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of cars. Now that's all three generations. It's up to its third generation now. Yeah, but that's a bunch of cars. And if you look at the past and previous big hit cars built in Britain, there aren't that many. So yeah, it was a massive hit, and still is a massive hit. By the way, they're pumping them out as we're speaking. They're pumping them off the line in Sunderland every 55 seconds. So a Qashqai rolls off.
Nice.
So nice. Yeah. So yeah, to come back to your question, so many geeky stories I could bore you with, but to give you a quick overview, that one of the interesting things about the Qashqai was that very early development was done in Japan. So when you start doing a car, the first thing you do are the sort of early layout drawings. You decide where the occupants are going to be, where the powertrain is going to be, what platform you're going to use. And because Nissan was a global company, the platform and powertrain catalog, if you can imagine it like that, it's in Japan. So a bunch of us,
Yeah.
about 30 of us, got in a plane and we went to Japan for a year to basically pick through the Nissan global parts catalog and decide which bits we were going to
Nice.
use. So I have, a bunch of stories of these 30 guys flying into Japan and living there for a year, trying to figure out how to do this car. Some of the stories are not printable and not publishable, so we'll keep them to ourselves. But that was a fantastic period, living in Japan, doing the whole lost in translation thing, and trying to figure out what this
Yeah.
car would look like.
Okay, so I just want to deviate for like half a second, but I feel like it's relevant. You do some writing for the Intercooler, which I'm sure a bunch of the audience has come across, and you did an article this week. I believe it was from this period, maybe not, of going to like an underground drift event in Japan.
Yeah. That article.
I mean, that sounds super cool.
That was actually a couple of years after I came back from Japan. I lived out there for a couple of years. I came back, but I was doing business trips to Japan almost once a month, and that article was during one of those business trips. I call that article rather unoriginally the real Tokyo Drift, and it hit a chord with the TI readers. I kind of threw it out there, sort of just a fun thing, because my thing on the intercooler is basically writing geeky engineering bits, and this was not. This was just a fun thing I did in Japan, and I threw it out there, thinking, oh my god, I'm not sure if this will work, but a bunch of people reacted really favorably to it. Folks who like the JDM scene, and it was that article for folks who don't subscribe to the intercooler was basically the description of a night I spent where one of my Nissan Japanese colleagues invited me to an illegal drift session out in the foothills of the Hakone Mountains. So, if you've seen movies like Initial D, it was basically that. Yeah. It was Initial D, real life. And there I was, the only non-Japanese dude standing on the side of the road with these crazy Toyota Soarers and Nissan Skylines going by before we were chased off the mountain by the cops. Fantastic experience. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's worth a read, and I love all of those like Tokyo Drift, etc. They're a bit like crap, but I also love the car side of it and drifting and whatever, and all of the sort of fun shenanigans around that scene.
What was amazing about that night, Sam, was it was so geeky because, as I've described, it was basically a drift battle between these two local car clubs. But not only were they sort of Nissan and Toyota fans, but they were specifically fans of a particular engine. So one team were basically Toyota JZ geeks who were hardcore JZ fans, and the other, the sort of enemy, were the guys who were hardcore Nissan RB 6-in-line fans. So it was your ultimate, bunch of geeks duking it out on this on this hillside in Japan, and just absolutely going crazy about the details of their engines. It was deeply, deeply geeky, but very fun.
Nice. And presumably those, I think you mentioned it, the cars are like drift cars. They take a lot of abuse. They sort of generally have bits falling off them. But then you get to like the powertrain and everyone's like, that's the stuff, all the detail, everything is there.
Yeah. Exactly. And they were true. I mean, my Japanese was actually pretty good at the time, but it wasn't good enough to have a technical conversation with these guys. But, they were absolutely going, into tiny detail, because they knew I was from Nissan. They knew I was a kind of a Nissan executive. So they were just over the moon to have this guy to talk about, what they'd done to their cam profiles, etc. It was fantastic. But one story I didn't tell in the TI article was, this would have been about it must have been 2 a.m. And suddenly the guys are like, okay, clear the road. We got to get off the road. And, they're pushing the spectators back, getting the cars pulled into one side. And there's suddenly kind of a serious atmosphere. And I'm thinking, well, what's going on? Is there a problem? And so they cleared the road. And next thing, 5 Subarus, Imprezas, come absolutely flat stick up the road. So, you could hear them miles off. You could hear that flat Subaru noise. And these 5 blue and gold, of course, Imprezas, highly tuned, just come banging through where we were, through these bends, blue flames flashing into the night, and just disappeared off up the hill and gone. And one of the Japanese guys just turned to me and said, I said, what the hell was that? And he said, Dave, son, that was grip team. Because we were the drift team. So they were the grip team. And the way he said it was fantastic. He was like, it was basically, those poor idiots, they don't understand. Like, they're in the grip. So we basically cleared the road, let the grip team go through before the drift team took over again. But it was fantastic.
Which of those teams do you think you sway towards the most now? Grip team or drift team?
Oh, for sure. Grip team, I simply don't have the skills to drift properly. The few times I've ever had a chance to properly try it, I'm really bad at it. So I'm going to say, by necessity, I'm going to say grip team, unfortunately. Through lack of skill.
As much grip as possible, even when drifting. Yeah. Cool. So one of the things, so a car like the Nissan Qashqai, and I know you also were involved in the Renault ZOE, which is, well, actually, I think tears into the next section quite nicely. Like, I always found cars like that quite interesting from how on earth do you make a car that is relatively cheap, or those are, pretty cheap nowadays, but has all the stuff, all the development, does all the things that your sort of super expensive car does now anyway, but it doesn't cost 50 grand. Sure, is that really challenging?
Yeah, without boring our listeners too much, the obvious answer is yes. But to go into more detail on that, the cars that impress me the most as engineers, the hardest cars to design are a C-segment family hatchback. Think Volkswagen Golf, Ford Focus, Hyundai i30. They are, to me, each to their own, but to me, they are engineering achievements as impressive as, a Koenigsegg or whatever supercar you want to name, or whatever, or even a Formula One car. And they're impressive for 2 reasons. One is exactly like you say, you're building to a cost. You're launching a product that is super competitive. The battle between Ford and Volkswagen or Toyota and Hyundai in that overpopulated family hatch market, it's savage. We're not even talking about every, dollar or every pound. We're talking about, fractions of cents are fought over, and the battle is won and lost in those areas. The second challenge you have is they're built in their millions, not in hundreds of thousands, millions of examples. If you have the smallest quality issue, you make a mistake on one part, potentially hundreds of thousands of people are going to be stranded at the side of the road, and the warranty costs go into billions. You're talking many, many zeros. So the challenges of coming up with an attractive, reliable family vehicle that someone can buy for, I don't know, £25,000, and that will run for 10 years without breaking down, it's incredibly difficult. It's not very glamorous, it's not very sexy, but the cost engineering challenge, while also controlling quality to very, very fine tolerances, is it blows me away. The people that do it and do it successfully blow me away. Which is why when people often ask me, what's the car that's impressed you the most, and I say it's a Mark I Ford Focus, they think I'm joking, but I'm not.
I totally get it, and it's also, you look at those cars now, and they have a lot of stuff about them is the same as a luxury high-end car from even like 10 years ago. Like, you shut a Golf door and it's like, thunk, feels solid. Like, you get in the car, it feels solid. Like, all that stuff that you used to go, you spend loads of money on, and then all the tech, like, it's kind of crazy.
Like, one of the examples I like to, it's a boring one, but, and I know people it's maybe a bad time to talk about golfs because people are having some difficulties with Golf 8 and software glitches, etc. But I like to get people to think about the screen on your instrument display on your Golf or Focus or whatever you drive. That screen, with the speedometer and all that. Well, that screen, compare that to your iPhone. An iPhone's a pretty impressive piece of kit, right? But if you take your iPhone on the beach and you leave it face up in the sun, you'll notice that over 30 degrees, the screen blacks out. It just goes black.
Yeah.
No biggie, you just put it in the shade and it'll come back. Take your iPhone and put it out in the cold at minus 30 and see what happens. Or sometimes if your iPhone doesn't work, just do a reset, no problem. That screen in your car, when you get into the car at minus 30 in the morning, you turn on the ignition, it absolutely has to fire up because it's safety critical. And it does. It does it every morning. It does it if you live in Finland. It does it if you live in Seville in southern Spain, where it'll go over 100 degrees in the summer. And it does it every morning. That is an amazing achievement. And like you say, it's something, it's banal. Nobody thinks about it. I don't think about it. I don't think about it every time I get in a car and think, wow, it's amazing, it's going to start. But it is. So, yeah, I'm still in awe of the industry, and I've been working in it for 3 decades.
Is that why? And I think we look at screens, or I look at screens in cars, and they normally get a lot of flack because everyone has, an iPhone or whatever, and you get your iPhone up and you flick between various things, and it's all super responsive, and everything just works, and it's like ding, 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 and you flick through it, and then you get in your car, and it can be a brand new car, a new generation, whatever, and you use the screen, and it's like, not that good, but is that because to then get all of that stuff along with all of the robustness and et cetera, is really hard, or just would be really expensive? Is that how it sort of works out?
Yeah, I'm not going to do that classic car engineer thing of, let me explain to you, Sam, how difficult it is, right? Because it's too easy in the case of screens, and particularly, human machine interface, or UI UX, whatever you want to call it. It is in a particularly difficult state in the car industry at the moment, and I think there is some simple bad design, right? So I'm not going to defend the industry. Consumer tech is way better at cool UI UX than the car industry has been. That's clear, right? As car engineers, we've done a bad job over the last 10 years, and there are some shoddy UI UX designs out there. And, you've heard people complain, and many people complain rightly, like, why the hell does it not have a volume button? Why do I have to go into 3 menus to do this?
Yeah.
Absolutely correct. All of those things are correct, and I'm not going to defend them. The good news is the car industry knows that, and it's trying to get better. You see a lot of partnerships with folks like Google, with Auto Android, or Apple, and that's going to help the car industry. So I'm going to hold my hand up, kind of representing the engineers, and say we've done a bad job on UI UX over the years. But having said that, you're right as well. There are some physical challenges that makes it tricky in a car. For example, going to the point you mentioned, tactility of a screen and response time when you swipe or when you click or something. Typically, again, an iPhone, if you take an electrostatic discharge gun and you hit your iPhone with a 30 kilovolt shot, it would be dead. Right? One shot, it's dead.
Okay.
That can't happen in a car. So in a car, everything you touch, be it a switch, be it a screen, be it the wiper stalks, they have to take repeated hits of very high voltage discharge and keep working. Why is that? Right? When you get out of your car in the summer and you put your foot on the ground, you touch this, and you touch the body, and you get that static shock, right? That you're building up enormous static energy within the car. And sometimes when you get in the car and you touch the screen, that's going to earth through the screen. So the screens have to be ESD robust. Now, that's not an excuse. I'm not excusing crap UI UX design there, but I'm just underlining what you say. There are reliability and safety factors in automotive design that there's not in consumer goods design. But the car industry has a long way to go. And I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see better hybrid UI UX designs. We're still going to see the screens because there's some very complex functions we have to control, but we are going to see a return to, sensible buttons for volume, or for rear defog, or for all the things that annoy us when we have to dig into menus.
We do really seem to have got to, and journalists and whatever, and people bang on about it, but we've sort of gone peak screen, and then it's almost like I think we've gone too far. We've got the new stuff that's just crazy. Personally, in my sort of car journey at the moment, I have currently have a 3 Series Touring. It's like a 2019 car. So it's the most modern sort of, and it has a nice mix of a great touchscreen that then links with Apple CarPlay, does the full width of the screen, which is a bug of mine when you use certain cars, when they only use a tiny fraction of your screen for things like CarPlay. But you do also have buttons and et cetera, et cetera. And then we've moved into the sort of one after that, which I think a lot of people like the RS6. But the A6 platform and a lot of modern Audis have gone for the multiple screen situation and a lot less buttons. And I got in that car and I can't remember, I had to do something and it was just a few touches. It was like a few more touches than I wanted to do. And I said, right, I'm not buying this. I'm not going to buy this generation of car because I feel like the next generation is going to go back, or it's going to do what the e-tron did, which is like one step back. And consequently didn't buy an Audi product, and I'm buying I'm going to get an E63S Estate. Completely impractical, but practical at the same time. But because I wanted buttons. Now, with buttons and screens, one of the arguments I've heard for why manufacturers might be pushing screens is they're easier to make and you don't have to deal with buttons. Do you think that is true? And are there a lot of issues with making buttons in cars?
No, I'm afraid I'm going to call BS on that one. I've heard it said many times on various forums and by various automotive journals that, hey, the only reason these guys are going to screens is they're cheaper to make than buttons. So I'm afraid I have to blow that myth and call BS. No, that's not the reason. No, I think it's more on what you touched on earlier, Sam. It's more, and this is not better, right? It's actually worse, what I'm going to say. It's more of a fashion effect. So you're absolutely right. There was a drive to peak screen a few years back, and let's call them out. Tesla. Every car maker, they will not say this publicly, but every car maker has been impacted by Tesla one way or another. They've benchmarked them. They've looked at their success. They've tried to figure out, how they can take elements of it. And of course, the Tesla had that ultra clean, one screen, no buttons look. And car makers chase that wrongly, rightly or wrongly. But the problem is that the sort of pendulum effect in the car industry, it doesn't right itself in 6 months. Because the development times are so long, it kind of swings. But exactly as you said, Sam, I think we're going to come back to a kind of a middle way. It swung from all buttons to all screens. And now there are some errors out there, and the industry will do, actually, kind of a halfway is probably right. Screens for when screen is appropriate, button for when button is appropriate. Exactly as you said. I hope the Audi UI UX team are listening to you, by the way. So no, to go back to this myth that car makers only put screens in because they're cheaper, it's just not true. So if you take a typical push switch, one of those ones that goes in and goes out and clicks on with a back illumination, they are built in there tens of millions of units by companies like ITT and their competitors, Costal, Continental, etc. They have entire factories banging those things out. They cost cents. They're very reliable because they've existed for decades. All the testing has been done. The tooling was amortized when you were a kid. They are cheap as chips. A fairly sophisticated TFT screen, even if it's replicating 20 of those buttons, I can assure you it's more expensive. It's more difficult in terms of R&D. So it's not being driven by cost. It's being driven more by fashion effects, which hopefully are on their way to self-righting themselves.
On that one with buttons, I think the example that I feel like you've probably given this in an article at some point, but so you've got your can of Coke in the car, in your cup holder, whatever. Someone knocks it and it goes all over that center console stuff. It could be a coffee, hot chocolate, something pretty sticky and grim. Yeah. The sort of how on earth do they survive that?
Well, they tested for it. Yeah, I did write another. I'm sorry, I don't want this pod to turn into a pitch for the intercooler, but I did write an article for the intercooler, which I called "Sweat, Shit, and Switches," and it basically tackled that question. You know, how do switches survive all the nasty things they're exposed to? Not just sticky coke, but human sweat on your finger. All of the abuse cases, and they're designed for it. Engineers designed for it, anticipated, and they're tested to death. Millions and millions and millions of cycles. And car makers have all sorts of nasty concoctions that they use to test the interiors of cars. So car makers have recipes for artificial human sweat. They have recipes for bird poop. Yeah. For testing the exterior and the interior of cars, and these standards have been developed over decades. And it's quite funny. You can see cars sometimes when they get it wrong, because it's still occasionally car makers will get something wrong, and you'll see some horrible peeling switch, and you think, okay, guys, you didn't get that one right. Which can be quite good fun.
So we've got manufacturers like Nissan, Renault, or Toyota who are making millions and millions of cars a year. And then we have new manufacturers like Tesla, like Rivian, let's say, or Lucid, or some of these EV manufacturers. And they've not been through. Tesla's getting to that point now where we're starting to get Gen 2. I don't know whether we'll actually ever see a Gen 2, or whether it will just be a continuous evolution over time, which we've sort of refresh. What I think a lot of people look at those manufacturers and go, yeah, but they've never built anything. How is this going to work? And then the valuations are mad when you look at what they have built or haven't built. I know Elon Musk recently has talked about the biggest issue is getting from whatever it is, making 500 cars to making 500,000, like that scaling step. And all of these little bits. When you start with a completely fresh company, platform, car, everything, that must be such a Herculean effort to do all the bits in one go. Yeah,
horrendously. Yeah, and I've spent some time working with a startup called BYTON. We can talk about that later. But I've been exposed to this myself. Yeah, I mean, enormously difficult, which is why, we all know it. Tesla, which I think we have to regard as no longer a startup, right? Tesla's been around since 2000 building cars since 2008 at least. So they're no longer a new player like Rivian and Lucid are. But that's why it took, from 1948 to Tesla for someone to crack that challenge you just described, Sam. It's horrendously difficult. Now, there are a few things they can use to help themselves, right? So they're not designing and building everything themselves from scratch from day one. So the new players, let's say Rivian or Lucid, they can rely on the tier one suppliers. Switchgear, for example. They're not going to go out and design a new switch. They're going to buy it from those guys I mentioned. They know it's already been tested. They're going to take a standard switch, maybe change the design, the styling of it. And the same, they can rely on suppliers like Bosch, Continental, Valeo, Hitachi, all of these decades-old suppliers to help them. And they also lean on, companies that are less well-known to the general public called engineering service providers. And so these are engineering firms for hire. Some folks might have heard of companies like Magna Steyr or Valmet in Finland. And there are a whole set of contract engineering services that these companies can help to effectively buy experience, buy the decades of experience that they haven't built up in-house. But it's still really difficult. And, if I had a hat on, I would take it off in respect to any of them, be it Tesla, Lucid, or Rivian, who make it across the line and get a car off the end of the line. Vast respect for them and good luck to them all.
Yeah, I am waiting to see a Rivian. That's of that bunch. I'm quite interested in those, like just what they're actually like. And as far as I can hear, the Rivian, everyone says it's pretty good. Like it sounds like it's really good. And the Lucid, I think, is a slightly different direction, but also it sounds like they've done a bloody good job. It doesn't feel like someone's first car.
No, and I know quite a few of the guys in both companies. I know quite a few of the insiders, and yeah, there's some real passion, great work gone into some of them. Some really really clever, dedicated people. So yeah, I'm rooting for them both. I love the courage to give it a shot. You may like the kind of style of the vehicles or not. That's another story. But I've got vast respect for anybody who rolls the dice and has a go, and they both had a go, and I hope it's successful.
Yeah. So, okay, going back a little bit to sort of timeline, you were at Nissan for a while, and then you moved to Renault. Is that right?
Indeed, yeah. So yeah, kind of to cut that story, long story short, but this was 2005, so the whole Renault Nissan alliance thing had happened in the meantime. All that happened around 1999, 2000. So we had, Carlos Ghosn come along, Renault sort of rescue Nissan from financial disaster, the whole Renault Nissan alliance. I'm doing this in fast forward. So by 2005, I got a chance to, I had sort of a choice. It was either go to Japan, but for good, not just for a business trip or for, a kind of a detachment, but go to Japan for good, or jump ship to let's say, the dark side of the alliance, and the Renault guys will be laughing at that, and go across the English Channel and work for Renault. So yeah, 2006, I found myself parachuted into Renault's enormous engineering center just out to the southwest of Paris. This Irish guy suddenly dropped into the kind of ground zero of French engineering. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, and what were you involved with when you moved there?
It was interesting because we're kind of back to base. Even though I had been in Nissan for 13 years, kind of built up my reputation, already done an entire project, the Qashqai, I kind of had to sort of prove myself again in Renault because, these guys didn't know me. This was just this guy coming in speaking really bad French. And as I said before, engineers, there's only one way to gain engineers' respect. It's not by talking, it's by showing that you know what you're doing. So I kind of had to start again. I ran what Renault called their architecture department, layout or packaging. So that's the department that does the very early layout for the powertrain of the vehicles, the chassis, the sort of underpinnings of the vehicle. I ran that team for a few years to kind of prove that I knew what I was doing, and also improve my French, actually, at the same time. So after a few years of that, I sort of started to get itchy fingers and started to look around for next project. Qashqai had been such a cool experience that I thought, okay, I want to do another one.
And what was that? How did that evolve?
Well, that was a very different baby. So this is the Renault ZOE, so that little electric vehicle that you see zipping around.
Yeah.
So around 2000 back into 2007 or 2008, suddenly we had a decree from the top. And when I say decree from the top, it was Carlos Ghosn, top down. Okay, guys, we're doing electric vehicles. And honestly, Sam, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it really was a kind of a double take. We were like, what? We're doing electric? What? Did you say electric vehicles? Like golf carts, milk floats, that kind of thing? Because 2008, the only folks working on electric vehicles were Tesla. And they hadn't yet even launched the Roadster. They were kind of, messing around with the Roadster. Yeah. There'd been a little bit of media coverage of it, but nobody cared really. There were just these kind of crazy Californian dudes working on it. And here was Carlos Ghosn, head of one of the biggest car companies in the world at the time, saying, okay, the future is electric and I'm going to put huge resources into it. So it's hard to imagine now from the viewpoint of 2022 how radical that was, but it was really radical. So my little team of platform layout guys, we started immediately sketching out a whole range of new platforms for electric vehicles. And one of them was ground up. It was a blank sheet of paper, nothing already done. We started sketching it out and thinking about how we do it. And that's the vehicle that turned into the Renault ZOE. And I kind of fell in love with it from the first days we were sort of thinking about it, laying it out. I thought, okay, this is going to be really cool. And I basically badgered every big boss in Renault from Carlos Ghosn on down to say, I want. And just to shut me up, I think they basically said, okay, stop annoying us and just go and do the project. So I got back in the driving seat of the Renault ZOE. So very similar job to what I had done on the Qashqai, but this time with no exhaust pipe.
Yeah. That must have been, because was that the first, from a major OEM, the first fully ground up electric vehicle that wasn't Tesla?
Not quite, because Nissan had got off the starting blocks a little bit earlier than us. So Nissan, in parallel, same boss, right? Carlos Ghosn was running the shop in both companies at the time. They'd started the development of the Nissan Leaf a little bit before us. So the Leaf was launched in mid 2010, and the Zoe came out at the back end of 2012, about 18 months later. So the true first mass production, affordable, practical, real electric car that normal folks could buy, the crown does go to the Nissan Leaf. The Zoe was the second, and of course I'm biased, but I think the Zoe was the first good-looking one.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. And when you're coming up with starting that process, then presumably because it's a blank canvas and you can start to do things like put stuff kind of, I don't know, whether can you move things around a lot more than you could conventionally. Did you see a lot of opportunities of that, like you're like tech might not be there for what you want to do, but you could see in the future how it might evolve and then build towards that? Or was it, could you do most of the things you wanted to do when you started that project?
So the second part of your question first, for sure, the tech was not there. The tech was not there. I mean, this was 2008, and you simply couldn't go and buy off the shelf a DC-DC converter or a high voltage junction box. You couldn't phone up Bosch and say, hey, can I have your latest generation of, onboard charger? They didn't have any. So that was kind of an advantage. It was kind of scary also, but it was an advantage. And to the first part of your question, we had super rare in the modern car industry, right? I can hardly explain how rare this is, but it was literally a blank sheet of paper. And, that doesn't happen. You're usually replacing some vehicle or, there's a production line constraint. But I still remember the very first meeting on Renault ZOE. There were three of us standing around a whiteboard, old school, a paper whiteboard. And the chief layout guy, whose name was Jose Fernandez, making two sketches. One had the engine in the rear, or the e-motor in the rear, and the other had the engine in the front. And we were literally just like brainstorming between us the pros and cons of rear engine, front engine. Yeah. So total flexibility, and that was amazing. But nothing existed. You had to think through how each system in the car would work. It wasn't just okay, let's get out the supplier's catalog and see which parts we're going to plug into this thing.
Yeah. One of the things I've found is I'm not a massive fan of hybrids at the moment. I think they sort of have a place, but I feel like they're overly complicated sort of bolt-on solutions to generally existing platforms. And I'll ignore certain manufacturers who've been doing it forever and do it very well. But a lot of the cars I've driven, let's say, I don't know, like Panamera, and then you get the hybrid version and it's like plus 250 kilos and all of that sort of stuff. And then we've moved on to the certain cars that it's one platform, but it has a combustion engine and also an electric version to it. And those, to me, that just seems like a really massive compromise for a completely different technology. Do you think that's sort of been the case? And what's the difference between starting from zero, let's say with the Zoe, or doing what people have done, I don't know, like a Corsa, or I've got an E208. So that sort of setup.
Yeah, Sam, we're risking here going to echo on each other, or confirmation bias, or however you want to see it, because I agree with you. I fully agree with you on hybrids. We'll come back to the dedicated platform in a moment, but my engineer soul has always had a problem with hybrids for the simple reason you say. So you take something that's very complex and very expensive, which is called an internal combustion engine. You put that in the car, and then take a second really expensive, complex thing, which is called an EV powertrain. You put that in the same damn car. So it just doesn't make sense as an engineer. That said, I fully understand it. I still admire the Toyota Prius as a fantastic piece of innovation, and I fully understand for certain folks who maybe don't have access to private charging. I know you touched on this in your last podcast. Might not be able to charge the vehicle at home. Maybe they need one vehicle for that very long journey at the weekend. I get why hybrids make sense today. I get it, but just as an engineer, my engineer soul rebels against them for sure. So it's to me, I like the purity of either pure piston engine cars or pure electric vehicles. Now, coming to your question, all right, what's best? Do you need to do a dedicated EV platform, or can you do a sort of a Swiss Army knife platform that can do anything, hybrid? Again, I'm going to come down in favor of the first. I think there are so many compromises you need to put in an EV vehicle if you're going to package protect for stupid things, right? Things like fuel tank packaging. You need to leave space for an exhaust run when you're going to do a piston engine version. Your crash paths are different. That to me compromises the platform. And I haven't yet seen a well-executed sort of hybrid solution. And the EVs, which impress me, especially by their efficiency, Tesla Model 3s, Hyundai's latest EVs, Lucid Air, we could come back to that again. Those are all very much dedicated EV platforms where the engineers have squeezed out every millimeter, every kilowatt hour, every Newton meter of rolling resistance. To me, there's enough of a market now in pure EVs to make dedicated EV platforms. And the EVs I admire are all dedicated EVs. I'm not having you go at your little E208. I think it's really cute, and I think it's a good car. But I think it could have been even better if it had been a dedicated EV platform. I
totally agree. And okay, something I wanted to ask you about this topic is, we, as a sort of society at the moment, we've got a lot of large vehicles, a lot of heavy ones, and sort of fuel economy is not raved about as necessarily as much of a thing that people massively care about. People care about it a little bit, but the fact that the majority of people drive a really heavy car with a massive frontal area and get, 25 mpg and think that's completely fine. In my E208, I get about 3.8 miles per kilowatt hour out of it. Like roughly, I get a bit more in town, a bit less if we drive faster, etc., etc., etc. Now, if that was a standalone EV platform, and as sort of, I want to know, where can we push that to in the future? Because obviously there's going to be massive benefits from, if you can run the same battery pack size and get double the range, maybe that's too optimistic, then you could have half the size of battery, of which then you will get more range because it's lighter and smaller and all of the stuff. Like, where's the scope of this? I know we've seen Mercedes recently do their sort of project, but how far do you think more efficient can we get?
Yeah, I think there's a fair bit of scope actually, and I'm really happy, and I thank you for bringing up this topic, Sam, because I think that the watchword for tomorrow is EV efficiency. Because the past few years, and please don't take this, I'm not Tesla bashing here. I'm a big Tesla fan, but the cool thing of Tesla on a drag strip, sub 3 seconds, 0-60. I mean, it was cool. The first few YouTube videos you saw, it was cool. The arms race of bigger and bigger batteries to get bigger and bigger brochure range announcements. I understand that 5 years ago when EVs were coming, and everyone was freaking out about range anxiety, etc. But luckily, the interest is changing, and more sophisticated customers, folks who've had an EV, who've operated an EV, they realize that ultimate range is actually not the issue. So the conversation is switching, exactly as you say, to fuel efficiency, or kilometers per kilowatt hour, or miles per kilowatt hour. The jargon is a little bit clunky, but we'll quickly get used to it. So I'm super happy that the conversation is switching here. Now, to come back to your question, how far can we go? Well, first of all, there's a few that number you just quoted for the Peugeot is pretty good, actually. That's already a pretty good number. But there's already a couple of super efficient vehicles out there, and I'm going to call out two. So Hyundai, so their latest vehicles, if you do the calculations on kilowatt hour per mile or kilowatt hour per, they're actually the top of the range at the moment. They're slightly better than a Tesla 3 long range. So Hyundai have done really good work in getting efficiency into the system, and not in super expensive vehicles. These are not super luxury vehicles just for rich folks. The other vehicle I'd call out, and this is the second time the Lucid Air. So the Lucid Air, the initial figures they've pushed out, and that's a big old car, right? That's Mercedes, somewhere between Mercedes E-Class and S-Class size. It's getting well over 5 miles per kilowatt hour. Because they've worked on the Yep. Now, I'm going to put a caution on that. That's WLTP. Okay, so you've got to. That's not real world. That's not an actual real person like you driving it around town. So we've got to take that with a little bit of pinch of salt. But the figures they've announced in their official homologation documents are really impressive, even though it's a pretty big, heavy car. So they've worked very hard on the powertrain efficiency, rolling resistance, all of the things, thermal systems, all of the things that eat energy. So I think there are big gains to be made. I think I wouldn't like to predict any figures. The Mercedes concept is kind of pushing it very hard, doubling the efficiency, but with certain compromises. But I think there's a bunch of progress to be made, and I'm really glad that people are starting to talk about this topic, and not just bloody 0 to 60 times, and not just how far can I go on a full battery.
And then you get companies like, I think Hennessy are making some crazy truck, or we have the Hummer EV that's like, I don't know what it is, 4.5 tons or something. And they're like, and it's going to have 500 miles of range because we put 400 kilowatt hour battery in it. Like, okay. So what? But that's going to take how long to charge?
Yeah. But Sam, there is, just because you mentioned, there is one topic that, I feel bad going here because, I can already hear the internet lighting up to saying, this guy Twohig is talking, But mass, right? I'm sure we're going to talk about mass. And for folks who are watching us in video, you can see I have proudly on the wall behind me, I have an Alpine A110, super proud of the mass reduction on that car, etc. But just let's talk about the effect of mass on EV range for a moment, because I have a myth I need to bust, and this is going to really disappoint you. Okay, I can see you're going to start crying at the end of this segment.
I don't think it's going to disappoint me, but it might. It might.
So here we go, right? So intuitively, you might imagine that if we make a much lighter electric vehicle, it's going to go further, right? That kind of feels intuitively correct. It feels that that's going to help efficiency. Exactly. That's what
maybe.
Exactly. That's
I would say if you're doing city driving, not 0 to 30 to 0 to 30 to 0 to 30, I think that does make quite a big difference.
No, this is where things get tricky. So
no,
unfortunately, and it's something that's badly understood. So I'll just take 2 minutes to do this, right? We won't get too geeky, but we intuitively you think it's going to be like that, and a lot of us who ride bicycles, that intuitive position, you've got it in your mind, right? A lighter bicycle is easier, it's more efficient. When you're climbing in the mountains, you want a light bicycle, so you think it's got to be the same for cars, right? It's not, and the reason it's not is regenerative braking. Okay, so every electric vehicle in the market today has. I can see Sam's gonna jump in and say no. So every modern EV has regenerative braking systems fitted, and those systems are remarkably efficient. They're almost too good, right? So when the example I like to use for people is you climb a mountain. Okay, so you drive your Renault ZOE or your Tesla or your E208 to the top of a mountain. The energy to do that is mgh, mass times g times the distance you've traveled. Here's the thing. When you coast down the back of the mountain, you get the same energy back, mgh. And here's the thing. Your regenerative braking system recovers about 90% of that energy. So if you do a big effort in reducing the mass,
really?
it actually doesn't. Yeah. Yeah, this is what folks don't. So to go back to your example in city driving, right, Sam? You accelerate to 30, and then
Yeah.
you're probably not going to brake hard in town, right? You're not going to bang the middle pedal. You're just probably going to let it coast down
Yeah.
or brake gently. As you're coasting or braking gently, your little E208 is scraping back 90% of the energy it took you to get there. So that's a very long explanation, but the
Yeah.
long and the short of it is, unfortunately, if you're going to spend money, if you're an engineer counting the dollars that you're going to put into an EV, you're better off investing in things like rolling resistance, aero, and thermal systems than in mass reducing the vehicle. Unfortunately, I hate to say that
Yeah.
because I love light cars, but in the specific case of
Okay.
EVs, it doesn't help that as much as you think. There we go.
This is assuming that, and this is all going to depend on the driving, etc., etc. But this is assuming that everyone's doing sort of like one pedal driving, or they're using the regen to its full and not using any brakes. Most people I've seen drive around definitely don't do that. So this is like, there is a best case scenario, and I wonder what what most people do, whether that varies on that. And then there is the situation where if you've got a full battery pack, let's say you started at the top of a hill and you charged up overnight and you roll down the hill, you don't get that much.
Yeah. So second case you just mentioned, 100% right. If your battery is charged, yeah, your regen braking doesn't work. It needs somewhere to go. So you're absolutely right. If you're top of the hill, recharge, or you leave your home. So you're absolutely right in the first few kilometers of your journey. What I said is not correct. But let us come back to the one pedal thing for a moment, because that's another, maybe folks don't fully understand that. I'm going to take the Generation 1 Zoe, not just because it's my baby, but because it doesn't have one pedal driving. It's but even in a Zoe, when you hit the brake pedal, so let's say you're driving in town, right? You go up to 50 kph and now you want to stop for a red light. So you're not one pedal driving, you take your foot off and you brake. When you push that brake pedal, you're not activating immediately the friction brakes. You're activating the motor, you're activating the regen. And the vehicle itself will then slightly blend in the friction brakes, but only to a minimum. So one pedal driving or not, all EVs will recover a large part of the energy. But you're absolutely right, assuming the battery isn't fully full. So I don't want to.
Which is a little bit of a niche case.
A little bit, because
it's one of those things I'm aware of in terms of how much, when I'm braking in town, whether it's one pedal or two pedals, I have up on the display the amount of energy sort of being recovered, how efficient you're driving, basically. And you can see there's only a certain amount of braking you can do before it goes over the sort of max regen. So I always try and brake it like up to that point of getting the most regen. Now, do most people drive like that? I don't know. But it's an interesting point. I think it's to cover that one off of the main thing is your frontal area and rolling resistance and stuff like that. And how far do you think we'll get double? No, double what we get now is a hugely variable thing. But let's just say your Lucid gets 5 miles per kilowatt hour, which I would be amazed if that got that around town. But I'm happy to believe that it's semi-possible. Will we get to 10?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Just throwing numbers out like this is a bit tricky, but I'm going to stop short of 10. I'm gonna think if we get to 7 or 8 miles per kilowatt hour, we'll already be doing really well. And after that, we would have to start so much compromising things like frontal area, tire section, etc. We'd be seriously eating into basic comfort and braking performance. So I don't think we'll get double, but we're still talking hefty improvements there. That's 25, 30, 40% improvements.
And it would be a massive difference, because you can have, like, for me, the idea of having a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack or a 150 kilowatt hour battery pack, or one of these massive battery packs. One, we know they're expensive. We know that's one of the big problems leveled at electric cars is the production of these battery packs. But if you can have a tiny battery pack or a small, like a 40 or something, and you could get 7 or 8 consistently on, let's just say, maybe even a motorway journey, then that's so much range that it doesn't matter. And you can charge it quickly without using insane amounts of power in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you touched on it with your last guest as well, but I fully agree with you. If we can significant improvements in efficiency and then couple that with improvements in the charge infrastructure. So I know they're improving, and you guys discussed the last time, there still is a genuine problem for folks who don't have their own private driveway. Fully recognize that. That's an unsolved problem in the industry at the moment. Someone who lives on, fifth floor of an apartment block or something doesn't have a private parking space. Yeah, that's a problem that we haven't solved yet. But with more efficient vehicles, better charge infrastructure, which is coming. And by the way, I'll throw it in as well, higher system voltages. So we've seen 800 volt systems introduced on expensive cars like the Porsche Taycan, Audi e-tron, but now we're starting to see them on more affordable vehicles. I'm again going to plug Hyundai Kia. I promise I don't work for them, but they've brought higher system voltages, let's say, to the masses, and that's going to greatly improve charge times. So yeah, I'm pretty bullish. I think all of that's going to improve over the next 5 years. But Sam, I do probably want to slip in before I get hate mail, right? I'm not saying that mass is not important. There's lots of other side benefits of mass. I just wanted to explain that it's not as important on electric vehicles as you might just intuitively think. But there's a bunch of other areas where engineers can make gains. So we mentioned some of the obviously aerodynamics, but there are things in rolling resistance. For example, the way the brake pads knock back is super important. The bearing design, you can design wheel bearings to have significantly less drag than they do today. Thermal systems are super important, really, really, really important in electric vehicles. And a good a well-designed thermal system can absolutely blow the socks off a standard system. So there's a bunch of areas for engineers to go at, as well as mass.
Yeah, one of those I heard about recently, I can't remember where it was, it might have been in Autocar or something like that, was a manufacturer's looking at using heat pumps in the car for all sorts of things. Like basically one of the things was using heat generated by the passengers, and things like that, of managing, because it is managing heat and flow and cooling throughout the full circular sort of environment of a car. It sounds like there's quite a lot of sort of way to go on that.
There is a massive variability also today. So again, I'm going to pat myself on the back here, but the Renault ZOE was actually the first mass-produced car to apply a basic heat pump. So it was the first. So recovering energy from the outside ambient air and using that to heat the interior. Tesla, for many, many years, just didn't get the heat pump thing. So the S and the X, zero heat pump, just didn't get it. And then on the Model 3, they released the so-called Octolink system, which is a very sophisticated heat pump. And that heat pump is scavenging some of the heat produced by the electric motors to recycle that back into the vehicle. And there are, like you say, various other ideas of basically catching every little bit of heat. For example, when you brake, those brake discs are producing heat. Maybe we can capture that and pump that back into the vehicle. But then, you have a very recent vehicle like the Ford Mach-E, Mustang Mach-E. And I was sure when I started looking at the specs that there was some mistake. I'm thinking, surely it's like 2020 it was launched. Surely Ford have a heat pump in the vehicle. It's a no-brainer. Guess what? They don't. None. Zero. So it's just, there isn't even a consistent sort of state of the art in technology. And that means there's a lot of improvement to do.
Yeah. It's an interesting, the overall efficiency, given a massive sway. We're not talking about 10-ton vehicles or something, because it's one of the reasons why a lot of people buy smaller cars. Now, there are benefits to a smaller car, zipping around town, etc. Rear wheel steering, I think, has actually really helped larger cars navigate around town. They're still big. But one of the reasons I bought the E208, or at least the E208, was because it was sort of smallish and good for nipping around. But if I could get a bigger car that was as efficient or more efficient, then you sort of are killing multiple birds with one stone. Because I think a lot of people have a small car because they're cheap to run and all the stuff. But if we can get to the point where the bigger cars are close in efficiency, then you could run a big car all the time.
Yeah, and again, I promise I don't work for Lucid or Hyundai or Kia, but again, that Lucid Air is quite an interesting vehicle in that sense because, it's, like I said, it's a big old car. It's very wide in particular. It's a very conventional sedan shape, yet it's very efficient. And, at the risk of opening a whole other conversation that would take us another hour, Sam, I do think we're going to see a change in the form factor of vehicles in the next few years. So for many years, the SUV or crossover has been, the go-to solution, right? From the Nissan Qashqai on, we've had a slew of SUVs, and that's been very successful. Customers have been very happy with them. Car companies have made a bunch of money. Everybody's happy. But it is not the most efficient design. So I do think we're going to see a return to either estate or wagons, potentially even a return of the MPV, the good old one-box MPV that died out a few years back. And I do think I've already seen, some hints, some ideas coming out, and I think we're going to see a return to a more efficient form factor, partly driven by EVs. And that's good because I have nothing particularly against SUVs, right? I don't have a religious objection to them, but hey, we've had enough of them now. It's been 15 years of them.
That's it. And I think one thing that EVs have brought, definitely for anyone that's owned one or used them, is you pay attention to efficiency a lot more, I think, because your range varies massively depending on how efficiently you're driving or the range of your car. And if you could go, at the moment, you could get, an example I've used recently is let's say you've got a BMW M340i, and you could have an M340i or whatever is X340i, the same engine basically, in an X3 or in a 3 Series estate. And dimensions wise, I think probably the boot space is probably pretty similar between the two. I don't know whether the X3 is a little bit bigger, but the efficiency you'll get between the two, you will probably get 25 to 30 mpg in the X3, and you'll get 40 mpg in the 3 Series, which in a petrol car, people seem to be reasonably happy going, yeah, I want the SUV, fine, it'll cost me a bit more. Your range is enough that it's not going to bother you. You stop for 2 minutes, you fill up, you move on. In an electric car, if you had the two platforms and one has 300-mile range and one has 400-mile range, I think a lot of people would look at that and go, yeah, I would quite like 400 miles of range.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think just going back to your point about, enjoying zipping around the city in the E208, let me just get on my hobby horse for a moment. And one particular vehicle dimension where I think we've gone crazy, and I'm speaking as automotive engineers and designers, I'm holding my hand up. You got it. Vehicle width. I mean, it's just not sustainable, especially in European cities. I drive quite a bit in Paris, and the width of modern vehicles it just takes away from the driving pleasure. Now, I know there are good reasons. Side crash impact is so much better than older cars, etc., etc. If I want to be T-boned in a car, I want a modern car. I don't want some 1970s or 1980s vehicle. But still, I think we can turn that clock back, be a little bit more disciplined in vehicle width, and get it back to, it just makes so much difference in driving pleasure. So I'm hoping to see vehicles with more reasonable widths and lower roof lines coming, which go exactly in the direction you're talking about in terms of vehicle efficiency and reduced frontal area.
Yeah, width is a really interesting one. The amount of excess width you have in a lane.
Don't get me started on Sam. Don't get me started on width.
Exactly proportional to the amount of fun you can have. Like a tiny car on a normal size road in the UK is a lot more fun than a car that's the exact width. And luxury cars and let's not dive into this too much, but like luxury cars, one of the things that makes a car luxurious to me is like how comfortable you feel driving around. And the big luxurious cars we have at the moment, if you drive them around London or, let's say a small Italian city or town or something, you are not having a luxurious experience because you are shit scared of scratching your wing mirrors and smashing into stuff or going through width restrictions or all of these things the entire time.
Yeah. Fully agree. And again, we could both do our, things were better in the old days. I'm not going to do that. There are some
I'm not saying that.
There are some good technical reasons why cars got wider, right? And again, I've seen what happens to human beings in a pole crash impact. It's not pretty, right? It's really not pretty. So the width we've added to cars to make them safer in side impact, all in a good cause. But there has been some lazy engineering and lazy design out there, and I think hopefully the industry is going to improve that in the next few years. Because, like you say, it adds to pleasure, it adds to the luxury experience, and it's more efficient. So, yeah, okay, I'll get down off that hobby horse now, Sam.
Yeah, let's jump off this one and into small. Let's talk about small and light. So after working at Renault, or I guess it's still under the same umbrella, you had a chance to get involved in this Alpine project.
Yeah, so lucky boy that I am. So that came about. The ZOE project was finished, and I was kind of casting around for my next job. Probably a little bit bored, to be honest, Sam. Going back to our conversation several times back, I was running sort of a division in Renault, big team, but doing a lot of man management and budget management and kind of things that weren't sort of setting my heart on fire. When I heard the rumor that Renault Group were finally going to resurrect the Alpine brand, and it's hard to explain maybe for a non-French audience, but Alpine is something that's tattooed on the heart of every car enthusiast. The company went bust in 1995, but kind of the French enthusiasts never been able to let it go. And since 1995, there had been actually 8 different attempts to get it off the ground. This was the 9th and final one. And same deal, I basically badgered my bosses, all the big bosses, anyone who might influence the decision to try and get on the Alpine project. Didn't succeed at first. I didn't manage to get there first shot, but I'm pretty persistent and I managed to get in there at my second attempt.
Nice. And okay, let's talk about this, the sort of plan from the outset. I'm sure you've talked about this sort of project quite a lot, but this concept of, let's make it light. And I want to know some of the challenges, because it sounds like to make it remotely affordable and light, we've seen Gordon Murray Automotive go the sort of other way, really, really light, but really, really expensive. Light and affordable, a headache sounds like.
Oh, yes. You see these grey hairs here, Sam? So let me give you, it's been described as the car that should never have existed. And that's kind of true. This project almost died so many times. It was kind of on life support all the way through. And right from the start, it got off to a rocky start. So I won't bore you with the whole detail, but some folks may know the project started as a joint venture between Renault and Caterham. So this was still when Carlos Ghosn was the big boss of Renault, and his number 2 was Carlos Tavares. So the guy who is now CEO of Stellantis Group. And Carlos Tavares was and is a genuine, dyed-in-the-wool car enthusiast. Gearhead, petrolhead, call him what you want. He really wanted to make it happen. And he persuaded Carlos Ghosn to have a go at, okay, let's do it. Let's resurrect this Alpine thing that we've talked about so many times. But to hedge the risk, the idea was to do it with a partner. So hedge the financial risk, hence the deal with Caterham. But within 6 or 8 months, it all went wrong. So the marriage between the two companies basically didn't even last a year. There were difficulties on both sides, financial difficulties on the Caterham side. And, almost a few months in, it was already almost a wreck. And that's the point at which I stepped in to rebuild the team, get it back on the rail, and exactly like you said, try and make a project that would make money. And the challenge, exactly as you say, for cars like this is there are two ways to do them. Either a car company decides, okay, look, this is just going to be a cost center. We're going to lose money on each of these cars. We don't care because the halo effect will allow us to sell our other cars. But that's not what Renault wanted to do. Renault wanted to do a car that would make money, that would stand on its own 2 feet. And that's really, really difficult to do. So, yeah, I guess my experiences on, let's say, normal kind of bread and butter cars, like the Qashqai and the ZOE, had taught me a lot about, how to count the pounds, shillings, and pence, or euros and euro centimes. Yeah. And that helped keep the Alpine project super, super frugal. So I won't give you too many numbers because they're still confidential for the Renault group, but I can tell you that this was not a shoestring project. It was developed on half a shoestring, and even that we were very careful in how we used the half shoestring.
Yeah. What was the final weight of a car?
So the Premier Edition, right, which is the launch edition, the vehicle that sort of got all the press kudos and lots of journalists wrote very, very nice things about it. It was 1080 kilograms, so 80 kilograms over the ton. And by the way, that was a specific decision as well. So the obvious thing would have been to say, okay, we're going to go for the ton. And we talked about it long and hard. We said, it'd be cool to have it at 999.99, But we decided not to, because the 80 kilos allows you to have a little bit of creature comfort, going back to what you said about just enjoying driving the car. So it allows you to have a fairly decent set of carpets. It allows you to have aircon. It allows you to have a reasonably good sound system. It allows you to do a little bit of lining in the boot so that when you put your bag in there, the bag doesn't get scratched to hell. And we thought that 80 kilos was a good investment. But one of the things we decided from day one, and this was one of the cool things about the project, we decided we were not going to ever lie about anything about the car. So, car makers can play games with masses, right? Car maker can tell you, oh, Sam, this weighs 1374. And you can play games.
Ferrari.
Okay, is that I didn't name anyone. The old wet mass versus dry mass stuff, right? The so-called negative options, where you option to remove the radio. Yeah. There's a bunch of tricks you can play. And we decided we're not going to play any of those tricks. If we say it's 1080 kilograms and a journalist takes it on a weigh scales, we're going to see 1080. And that actually, that stood to us, because when we announced anything to do with the car, the press realized that, okay, these guys are actually not playing games. When they give us data, it's bang on the nose, or it's even a little bit pessimistic.
That's a great way to approach it. And lots of manufacturers, like you say, maybe change that a little. It actually, there's been a regulation change recently, I think in Europe, where you're no longer allowed to come up with like all these kind of rubbish options that basically no one's ever going to spec, and your weight has to more fit with like a kind of like a base spec or an average spec car. Are you aware of this?
Yeah, that's actually baked into the so-called WLTP regulation, or Worldwide Light Vehicle Test Protocol, a bit of a mouthful. But that does effectively, like you say, cut down on some of the games that manufacturers used to play with the so-called negative option. A classic one to put on a negative option, by the way, was you put the entire NVH pack on a negative option. So all of the sound deadening, you could just specify it as a negative option, and you could just untick that box, and suddenly you've just saved 80 kilograms. But you never build a car like that. You just have it there kind of hanging on the options.
No.
So, yeah, those old games are over, thankfully.
Nice. I rate that. It's funny how people, do all these things. So throughout the project, it must have been, one, extremely difficult to get down to that weight, and then you've got to make sort of choices and compromises along the way to get the weight, and then also the price and all of those sorts of things. What were some sort of big decision processes that could have gone one way or the other throughout the process?
Oh, a bunch of them. I'm trying to think of a few examples. So, simple one, seats. We had a long debate about seat adjustment. Should we have seat back adjustment on the vehicle? Or are we going to go for a fixed bucket? And we threw that between us quite a lot. A lot of people thought, no, you at least need a seat back rake. Come on, people are different shapes, different sizes, different ages. But we bit the bullet on that one and said, no, we're gonna go for it. We're gonna try and design one bucket that's comfortable for everybody as much as possible. And that saved a bunch. That saved, from memory, 1.4 kilos. A similar one, do you put a seat slide on the passenger seat? Do you allow it to have longitudinal adjustment? Because you could, in theory, just fix it as far back as possible, and that would save you 600 grams. You take out the two seat rails. But that one we decided not to do because we thought, well, that's a bit of a compromise, because if we do that, you can't slide the seat forward and put a briefcase or a carry case behind it. So there are a couple of trivial examples. Of course, the big one, Sam, the big one that you're going to want to pick have a bone to pick with me on is we decided not to put a manual box in it.
Yeah. In that decision, I have feelings on this one. I think a lot of people do.
No, you do.
Do you think, would you stand by the decision to not offer it as an option or an extra, or to stick with the gearbox there was? And what were I feel like there were some hurdles in doing that as well.
Yeah. No, honestly, the answer to your question, do I stand by it, is yes. But I'm immediately going to caveat that with yes, given the economic constraints, right? And so, in other words, if we thought we could sell more cars, therefore have a larger volume, if we were absolutely sure that, no, this car is going to be a huge economic success, of course we would have done two versions of the car. I would have been absolutely delighted to be able to offer a manual box option to the real, let's say, the hardcore enthusiasts. But given exactly what you said in the introduction, the fact that it's going to be low volume, that means you've got to be very, very careful with the money you're spending. And by the way, the money you're spending is the customer's money. It's not Renault's money. I'm spending the money of the folks who buy the car. You have to be really careful on where you invest their money. And given that economical constraint, I'm going to say, I stick by the decision. I think for most customers, most of the time, it's the right decision. So I stick by it, even though the hate, you can send the hate mail to my DMs.
Nah, it's all right. And then I was actually going to follow that up with, if you were given, let's say, and I can't remember what the retail price of the car was, but let's just say another $5,000 per car in price, and you sold the same number, etc., or you were going to sell the same number, or another 10. What would be the things? What would change? What would you? Where would that money sort of go, or in that, if you were allowed that?
Yeah, I've got the retail price. I'm sorry, I've got it sort of memorized in euros rather than pound sterling. But the retail price at launch was 59,000 euros, around there. So that's 63, something like that in pounds. I won't go too much into the maths of it, because again, we'd reveal confidential details of it. You could work backwards to find out how much we had, but it would have to be significantly more than $5,000 extra, Sam. It would have to be you'd be over 10 grand more.
Okay, let's go over 10. What would change, or what would you put in or take out or whatever?
Oh, okay. So if we had a completely unlimited, well, not completely, but a more, probably, honestly speaking, we probably would have done a manual option, because we knew at the time, we would be disappointing a certain proportion of the market. We knew, particularly in the UK, the UK customers are the hardcore stick shift diehards. So I'm gonna tick the manual box. I'm gonna say this as well, Sam. But this we'd have needed much more than 10 grand for this one. But it would have been lovely to dream of bringing it to the United States. To be honest, that is another one where we would have loved to. I mean, to the present day, I get so many people contacting me saying, Dave, Well, we
Yeah.
wonder, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it? I'm talking about your fans in the States. Yeah, it would have been fantastic to be able to do a so-called federalized version, which could pass the
Yeah.
different crash and emissions tech over there. That would have been cool because the US is a big sports car market. And when subsequently I moved to California, every time I'd see a Cayman out there cruising down the Pacific Coast Highway or cruising around San
Yeah.
Francisco, I used to think, damn it, an Alpine would look good here.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And then, because there's a question of sort of companies, aftermarket companies that exist, and a lot of people go, right, well, you think you're better than the manufacturer, and let's assume that we're not spending the same money on the parts that we're adding. So you've got a significant budget to add aftermarket stuff. What sort of difference do you think you can get with, let's just say you bought some really expensive suspension components. Now, does that make a difference? Or actually it's more about getting the right rates and bits and pieces and stuff like that?
I'm going to say more the latter, but particularly in the case of Alpine, because the car is so light and because it's got relatively long suspension travel. They're the key to successes to. I don't want to sound arrogant here, but the folks that really like the car, the journalists that wrote about it, and all of that's what they're expressing basically is the lightness of the suspension travel. So it's probably not worth throwing a bunch of money at very, very sophisticated suspension. I don't want to mention any particular brands recommend or not recommend them, but probably not worth it. What definitely is worth it is getting the car really well set up. There's a couple of specialists in the UK as well who are doing fantastic jobs, taking off the line normal customer cars and just getting them set up really, really precisely. Folks like Litchfield, folks like Life 110, David Pook, who you've had on the podcast, they'll take the car and rather than just throwing, 20 grand's worth of shiny struts at it, they're just going to set it up really accurately for that customer's usage. So, for example, if you're doing a lot of track days, they're going to set it up with the spring rates, the ride height, the geometry that suits you. If I'm not using it on track, but I want just a really, really good backroad cruiser that's going to work in all weathers on bumpy roads in mid-Wales, they'll set it up like that. So, and the car does benefit from that. But it's not a car where you need to chuck a bunch of money at expensive components to get it working really well.
Yeah, and then presumably, like one of the situations, so I'm currently in the process of buying an E63, and the main problem with those cars, and I would say most Mercedes at the moment in the UK, is they're just not set up for our roads. Like they're all too stiff, and which in Europe works perfectly. When, let's say with Alpine or even Renault or all the cars you worked on, do they sort of, the specs shift a little bit depending on the market? Like just set tiny things like, spring rates or whatever? Or do you have to, how do you pick that middle point if not?
Generally speaking, the answer is no. So to be able to do country specific setups, you need to be doing really huge volumes. So the Alpine, for example, let's start with Alpine. Really, really small production volumes, right? Building tens of cars per day. You can't have a country-specific setup. So we tried to do a setup that would work everywhere. But specifically thinking about not beautiful, auto routes or autobahns with fantastic. We set it up in the back roads around Lyon. And little French back roads with frost damaged tarmac, and we were specifically thinking of British B roads. We did some late testing in the UK to set it up, but we were setting it up as a back road car. But going back to your general question, some car makers do have big enough volumes to be able to do country specific setups. I mean, I'll mention one, Toyota. So Toyota are known to do a specific suspension tune for the land of my birth, for Ireland. Very small market, but they actually do a specific suspension tune for the Irish market. But Toyota have enough volumes to be able to manage to do that. But so long answer to your question, Sam, but generally car makers are trying to hit a compromise.
Interesting. Because that's something I've thought about recently. It's like you've got all these cars and you just sort of accept the general suspension setup that comes from factory, and actually it's not optimized for you. Like it could be very good, and often they are very good, but they're not what you want, which could be totally different.
Yeah. One modern exception, though, very unusually, and they got a little bit of stick for doing it, but it was interesting. The Polestar, which came out with multi-adjustable, tunable suspension on a road car, and everyone, what the hell? But that's getting something towards what you're talking about. But just to get back to your E63 for a moment, I don't want to bash any vehicle, right? And I don't want to get back on a hobby horse when we were already doing our crying about cars being too wide. But let me just cry for a moment about vehicle ride quality. So vehicles have progressed enormously, right, in performance, in reliability, in safety, in braking. Modern vehicles' brakes are just awesome. In handling. But my God, we've regressed in ride quality. And we've regressed so badly now that a lot of people actually have never driven a car with good ride quality. So they literally don't know what they're missing.
Yes.
We've got so used to cars with super short suspension travel and super low profile tires that people think the ride is okay because they've never driven something with more travel and with a high side profile tire, which rides really, really well. And again, if I could have if I could have my fairy godmother grant me two wishes, one would be, please let's make narrower cars, and two would be, please let's go back to reasonable suspension travel and smaller wheels. Please, please, please.
Yes, that was something when I was doing the sort of rounds of various manufacturers and whatever, looking for this sort of bigger car, talking to salespeople, and it's not their fault, but I realized that I was talking to people that often hadn't driven the competitors' cars or other representative vehicles in the space, for example. Like you get in what did I do back to back at a sort of test thing recently? I did Mercedes GLE and then E and S class, and everyone I think has this image in their head that SUVs are really comfy, and the seat might be comfy, but this in terms of the suspension ride and everything, and doing S class versus GLE. And even I did Flying Spur versus Ben Tiger, I did a couple, and the SUVs in a straight line, fine, like they're okay, but they weren't like great. Go around a corner, ride quality really bad. The company, we get some British cars like Range Rover, they just go, we just want it to be comfy, and they do the whole waft thing, and it is comfy, but so many manufacturers, like I went to this drive a previous pre-facelift E63 or E53, I think it was, because that shape in the sort of premium whatever category that it's in has the most boot space. So I was like, I want the most boot space. It's got to be an E-Class. I went and drove the E53, came back and said, okay, what's wrong with this car? Like, why is it so bad? And they all looked at me like I was a complete idiot. They're like, no, what are you talking about? It rides great. I'm like, it doesn't. It rides like shit. Seriously, it's awful. And they're like, no, it's great. I'm like, no, it's not. And you're just like, why am I banging my head on this thing? You go and drive the Audi versions. Like my S4 was like pretty good. An RS6 on air suspension is really good. Even with the stupid big wheels, it's surprisingly good. But everyone has this image that, let's say Mercedes, are luxurious, great riding cars. And actually the reality now is most of them aren't. But it's all the things we've discussed. And it's just like...
No, you're absolutely right. And again, we can't blame the guys and girls working in the dealers either, because they don't have either the
No.
time, or they'll have been trained by their OEM. So let's say it's a Mercedes dealer. They'll have gone to a training course. Of course, they'll have had a few days of training in the customers, in the vehicle's features, etc. And they'll have had a chance to drive the whole range, but they won't have had the competitors there, probably. So if they're good and if they're interested, they'll know about their own car. But exactly as you said, they don't have the time, or they haven't had the opportunity to benchmark the competition. So it's a tough one. But yeah, I'm an advocate of, bring back good ride quality. Come on, let's have some cars that ride and by the way, ride and handle. Yeah. It's not one or the other. There are cars out there that do both.
Yes. And we seem to slightly get a choice at the moment of, you can have good ride. I would say of those sorts of cars, saloon cars, I think that Audis at the moment ride the best, BMWs in the middle, and Mercedes. It's just taking those three brands. Obviously, there's many other brands. But I chose the 3 Series because it was kind of in the middle, but it handled much better than the Audis, etc., etc. So why can you not have both? Because you can absolutely have good driving dynamics and good ride. Like a rally car rides really well.
Yep.
Handles amazingly.
Yeah. No, it's possible, and I'm hoping it will come back. But for it to come back, OEMs will basically do what they can sell, right? OEMs will literally respond to what the customer wants or what they think the customer will buy. So, it doesn't need a little bit of sort of bottom-up push from us, the consumers, the car buyers, to say, hey, I don't want my back to be, jarred to death every time I go over a little joint in the road surface. We want better riding cars, please, guys. And that will hopefully get the OEMs to wind the clock back a little bit.
And I think it's happening.
Yeah.
It's happening. Like, the reason I'm looking at this one is the facelifted version is slightly better. It's like slightly better. Audi with their RS models, if you looked at an RS3 from 10 years ago, it had horrific ride quality. Same with the A45. Now the new RS3, and each generation has changed and they've got better. The damping's got better. It's just got better. And I think we used to have this perception, and general public used to have this perception, that a stiff ride was a performance ride. And I think people are starting to realize that just doesn't have to be the case, and also it's not very comfy. An avenue I would like to explore, and I know we've been going for a long time, but after the Alpine phase, you did a stint with is it BYTON cars? But
BYTON. Yeah.
I want to sort of move slightly past that. Waymo and autonomous driving. What were you doing there?
So Sam, I'm gonna duck that question a little bit because it is really top secret. I know that sounds bad, but if I answered your question, you'd see in the back of the screen, you'd see a bunch of black-clad lawyers from Google would wrestle me to the floor and put silver tape on my mouth. No, jokes apart. I can't say exactly what I was doing there, but what I can say is it was part of Waymo's kind of overall partnerships team, where they work with exterior companies. And obviously, this is not a giveaway. Waymo work with many OEMs, so the ones in the public domain, folks like Stellantis, ex-Fiat Chrysler, Jaguar Land Rover, the Renault Nissan Alliance, etc. So I was part of the team that was dealing with those companies and basically doing the engineering translation between the vehicle technology and Waymo's autonomous driving stack. And I can mention one other car maker because it's now in the public domain, because Waymo have since showed the car actually. So it was a collaboration with the Chinese car maker Geely to launch a new brand called Zeekr with a Z. And Waymo showed off their first custom-built, driverless robo-taxi that will be built in conjunction with Geely, and that was showed off a couple of months ago. And I may have been working on that, possibly. Who knows?
Okay. Right. So I have a few. I'm really interested in this space and how it's going to go. And I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and we were sort of talking about autonomous cars. And I don't want to get too into the sort of what Tesla's doing at the moment, but because that seems to provide a lot of interest from the general internet, and some hate and some not, and whether beta testing is an acceptable thing, etc. But in terms of the tech used by various companies, whether it's camera based or a mix of sensors and stuff like that, we do have some sort of fundamental questions that are going to come up at some point about autonomous cars driving on roads with other cars. And one of the big ones is the sort of, someone's pushing a pram out and the car has to make a decision about whether it crashes into a baby or a street sign or protects its owner, and all of these sort of like philosophical questions about autonomous cars. How have you done anything in that realm? And like, what are your thoughts on how we're going to go with that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so well, that's a big question, Sam. So I think the first thing we've got to the first thing we've got to talk about is we do have to separate, and this gets really dry and boring really quickly, so I'll try and keep it short. We've got to separate the realm of ADAS, okay, driver assistance systems, with true autonomous driving. That's the first thing, because they're confused in people's minds at the moment, through the fault, by the way, of engineers like me using impenetrable jargon and maybe the press not being able to explain it clearly enough. But very easy question is the following. You've got to ask yourself, if the car is so-called autonomous, you've got to ask yourself, can I sit in the back seat? If the answer is yes, you can sit in the back seat, it's autonomous driving, so-called AD level 4 or level 5, defined by the SAE. If you have to sit in the front seat, or if you have to have a driving license, you have to be awake, you have to be sober, it ain't an autonomous vehicle. It is a vehicle equipped with an ADAS system. So that's the first thing we've got to get clear. And Tesla, for example, let's go there, but let's risk the hate mail. Tesla's system, be that autopilot or full self-driving, it is an excellent, I'm going to underline 3 times, right? An excellent ADAS system. It is an L2 ADAS system, and it's one of the best out there. It's comparable to, Super Cruise from GM or the systems on Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Excellent system. It's simply not autonomous driving. So that's the first thing we've got to get clear. And everyone who's working on true autonomous driving, that means you can sit in the back, you can go to sleep, you can be someone who's visually impaired, or in fact, you could be just a pizza. You don't have to be a human being at all. Every company, with no exceptions, Sam, there are no exceptions, are working on the holy trinity of sensing technology. That means camera, radar, plus LiDAR. There is no disagreement among the experts in the field. There is full consensus. You need all 3. So that's the first thing. And again, that's not bashing Tesla. That's not I underline it again. Their system is great. You just got to take it for what it is, which is a driver assistance system. Now, coming to your question about what happens if a mom pushes out a push car and you have to kill the kid, or there's 10 people on the other side, or do we kill those? This is known in the business as the so-called trolley car problem, right? It's known as that in the US. And frankly speaking, it is a philosophical mind experiment, and it's very interesting to philosophers. It is of zero interest to the engineers working on the autonomous driving system. No one spends more. Maybe they chat about it at the coffee break, right? But the engineers are trying to get the systems significantly safer than human behavior statistically. Okay, so let's take that. In the US last year, 40,000 people died on the roads in the US. Okay, the engineers are trying to get that to a point where, and please don't quote me on this, right, where maybe it will be divided by 10. Maybe instead of 40,000 people, 4,000 people are going to die. So significant improvements, not just 10 or 20% improvement, but like significant order of magnitude improvement. And all of the work being done on the sensors, on the tech stack, on the testing, on the simulation is aimed at that. It's aimed at getting the general safety level improved. It's not aimed at very specific, well, what if a dog runs out and then there's a lady with a push car and this... That's not how it works. It's a general statistical approach. And but aim genuinely at, not trying to just make a couple, it's not a slightly better approach. It's genuinely trying to move the bar, a long way ahead. And that's why it's taking so long. That's why it's taken decades of research.
And I think, I don't know how you feel about it, but if I'm getting in a car and I'm driving, I accept that ultimately if I make a mistake and I crash and I kill someone or whatever, or I die, it's on me. If I'm in the back of a car and it's driving itself, then it's on the person that made the car or whoever's in, whatever, it's not on me, it's on someone else. Now, I'm at the moment happy with the risk level of me getting in a car and me driving it. I've made that decision. If I get in a car that's autonomous, I don't know what level of risk. At the moment, I'm kind of not really comfortable with any risk. Okay, academically, there has to be a small bit, but the chance that car could make an error and kill me or kill a bunch of other people, but let's just say, more importantly, me. When you take 40,000 deaths a year and you turn it into 4,000 deaths a year, but if that's 4,000 people that were sitting in the back and end up dead, and have kind of been killed by the manufacturer, maybe not, but ultimately it's under their control, that's quite a different situation. And how is that being approached, and what's the sort of strategy moving forward on that?
Yeah, so big questions here, Sam. But first of all, you're absolutely right. So when we talk about ADL4L5, absolutely right. You're not driving. You are not the driver. The driver of the car is the machine, from a technical point of view, and more important, from a legal point of view. So that's one of the huge challenges for the leaders. Companies like Waymo, Cruise, Argo, Aurora, etc. They know that, obviously, and that is one of the massive challenges they have. By the way, it's also one of the key barriers to adoption, because people say, well, why are they not here already? Why don't we have, I've heard that Waymo operate in Phoenix, Arizona. Why is it not in London? Why not? Let's go. One of the reasons is exactly what you just said, reassuring the general public. So it's not enough to convince the governments of each country that, look, we've done this testing, blah, blah, blah. Here's the statistics. Here's the simulation. Here's the results of our railroad and simulation testing, and therefore get the laws modified. It's not that. We have to convince you. We have to convince the general public that not only is it safe enough for you to get in the car, but it's safe enough to put your loved ones in the car, your kids or your mom or your dad or your husband, boyfriend, wife, whatever. And that also that's a massive work that's undertaken at the moment. So again, I don't want to, push Waymo too much, even though I'm an ex-employee and I think it's a great company, but we're starting to see those companies do that work. So Waymo last year, for example, published a really detailed safety report analyzing every incident that it has ever had in the last 7 years of operations, and they actually released the sensor data as well. So they released what all the sensors saw at the time of the accident, so that independent researchers could rerun the accident and see if it could have been avoided. So that kind of open data is what's going to eventually convince first experts, then journalists, then the general public that, okay, this technology is safe enough for me to put my loved ones in. But yeah, the companies I mentioned, the leading companies, are absolutely, it's not just a technical challenge. It's not just a bunch of engineers typing code. It's a bunch of lawyers. It's a bunch of public affairs specialists, city affairs, city planners, tackling those problems that you mentioned. And again, I'm going to go back to ADAS for a moment. So what's the fundamental difference with ADAS, driver assistance system? The driver, the clue is in the name, right? The driver, legally speaking, is still the driver. It's the human being. If your system beeps at you and says, Sam, please take control in the next 10 seconds, and you blow it, and you don't take control in the next 10 seconds, and there's an accident, that's on you, my friend. So it's a much easier legal situation also. So yeah, Sam, we need a whole other podcast to go into this in detail.
Yeah, I know. And it's an interesting one. And I think at the moment, I think the public general knowledge of the difference is so low. And I think a lot of people want to, and not picking a brand, just any ADAS system, you get in the car, and if it will stick in its lane and brake when the car in front slows down or whatever, generally I think a lot of people go, oh great, it's driving itself. I'm going to start doing some other stuff. And you're not paying attention, and then we've got loads of problems associated with that. Something that, that's another sort of not like thought experiment, but when you've got a car that's fully self-drive, ignore the stuff. It's driving itself, and you're sitting in the back. When something goes wrong, let's say you're in the motorway, and I don't know, one of your systems fails, or you get hit by a rock, and it just so happens to hit the camera or a certain thing. And or the motor's not working and it's starting to slow down. How does the car put itself in the safest place possible, rather than just park itself in the middle of the motorway, puts the hazard? Because a lot of cars now will just slow down to a stop and put the hazards on, of which you're then stuck in the middle of a motorway.
Sam, such a good question. Can you please, can you just invite me back and we'll do an autonomous car session? Because this stuff is so fascinating, but it takes some time. Let me have a quick run at the second part of your question. And
and then we'll move on.
So the short answer to the second part is high levels of redundancy. So true self-driving cars, not talking about cars with highway assist, driver assistance, but true L4, L5, the systems by definition have to be highly redundant for what you said. So first of all, the sensors. You can't just run it on two cameras for the reason you just said. What if one camera gets a rock through it? You're snookered. So you have to have multiplicity of many cameras, several radars, and several lidars, so that, statistically, there's always going to be at least one eye is still going to be working. But also, that redundancy applies also to what are known as the motion control systems, steering and braking. So exactly like you said, it's not sufficient to simply stop in the slow lane of the motorway and put the hazards on. That's not going to be a good idea. So even if the vehicle has a full power steering failure, it needs to be able to steer itself into what's technically known as the MRP, minimum risk position, which probably means taking the off-ramp from the motorway or the freeway and parking in the first safe parking space. Guess what that means? That means it has to have two power steering pumps. Not just one, it has to have two. It has to have two power supplies. It has to have double everything, full redundancy, avionics style. And that runs through all the systems in the car. So again, it's underlining that there's a world of difference between, something that can temporarily take over control on the motorway and use you as a backup. You are the backup system.
Yeah.
And a truly autonomous vehicle, they are, day and night in terms of technical complexity. They're fascinating things under the skin. And just to go back to your first point, I fully agree. I think the general public's understanding of this stuff is sadly lacking. And I'm going to point the finger at three parties for that. First of all, us, the engineers. I think we've done a bad job in kind of making the jargon simple enough for everybody to understand. We love our terms and we love our acronyms, and it's boring to most people. Secondly, I think the car makers have been very loose in their use of terms. So, for example, Mercedes uses Drive Pilot. GM uses Super Cruise. Tesla uses Autopilot. But the actual functions in there, that doesn't tell me what the thing actually does. It's just a marketing name. So the OEMs have been too fast to cook up cool-sounding marketing names that actually don't help you understand. And the third finger, I think, has to point a little bit, and I'm going to point this very gently, right, at our friends from the automotive press, who maybe haven't been disciplined enough in use of terms, use of technical terms, and kind of translating the engineer's jargon for the general public. So I'm hoping as well in the next few years, the three parties I mentioned, but I'm starting with us, the engineers. We need to start speaking bloody plain English to people and start helping people understand what this technology is and what it is not. And if I can help a little bit with doing that, I'll do it gladly. If we had
I
more
think
time.
it would be very good. Yeah, yeah. It would be really good if all manufacturers and journalists and everyone, whatever, referring to certain types of systems
Same
had to
words.
use the same words that were
Yeah.
easy. When you heard them, they made sense, and you go,
Yeah.
yes. Like
Yeah.
it's a drive it yourself assistant system or whatever. Like there's no way you're thinking that car's driving itself. Like that sort of stuff would be super helpful. But yeah, it's an interesting, it's a problem. Right, I'm conscious that we're ticking on. So I normally wrap these up with 5 questions. Do you have? I'm just going to fire into it because I think you know what these are. Do you have a most memorable driving trip or journey?
You know what I do, and it's not. I was talking to my wife about this, and she said, "You can't tell them that because it's not a road trip. You should be doing something like across America or something." And it's not that, but it was basically to make the story fairly short. It was just before the launch of the Alpine. We launched it at the Geneva show in 2017. And the winter before, it was December, the marketing guys decided, wouldn't it be cool if we had a couple of prototypes like running around Paris and we can take photographs of the cars with like the Eiffel Tower in the background? And, this is totally, by the way, car companies don't do this. You don't take pure prototypes and run them around Paris 3 months before you reveal the car in Geneva. You just don't do it. But because we were Alpine, we were kind of crazy and we could break the rules, and we did it. So we basically transported 2 cars, real hand-built protos, into the center of Paris at night, 1 a.m., unloaded them from the transporter, and we drove them around in the rain, all of the Paris landmarks. And I remember just driving the car around the Place de l'Étoile, where the Arc de Triomphe is. I remember driving it around thinking, I can't believe I'm doing this. It's just like, this is the first Alpine that's been built for the last 30 years. And I'm driving around the Place de l'Étoile, at dead of night. This is just surreal. And that was, that's probably the most memorable drive. It was like I don't think we went over 20 kph all night because we were in town and we didn't want to get in trouble with the folks in blue. But it was awesome.
Yeah. That sounds pretty cool. I like that. And dodging any random people that are like, hang on a minute, what is that?
And I'll tell you one quick anecdote about it. So, we were trying to form the cars up, and obviously we had an opening car, just to drive ahead of us, and we also had a recovery vehicle, right? In case one of them threw a problem and we had to put it on a loader, we also had that vehicle, and we had a van with a couple of photographers in it. So we had a little convoy, and we all had little walkie-talkies to keep it together. So I was the lead car, and I was outside, parked on the curb, right in the middle of Paris. But it's taking a little bit of time to form up. The guys are not there, and I'm on the walkie-talkie getting a little bit annoyed with everybody, saying, "Come on, guys, we got to go, because people were walking by and starting to get out their smartphones." Right? So I'm sitting there in the car, just idling, getting increasingly frustrated. And next thing, a police car pulls up next to me, like Paris police, the full lot, a black and white. And the guy just said, window down. So I dropped the window, and the guy goes, "Bonsoir," and I went, "Oui, bonsoir, monsieur." And he just went, "Nice car." And I looked at it. It was a Renault Kangoo, and I just went, "Yeah, I like yours too." And and he just said, "Is that the new Alpine?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he said, "You just going for a drive?" And I went, "Yeah." And he just went, "Have a great evening. Enjoy it." And just drove off.
Nice. Right. If you can only drive one car for the rest of your life, and you're allowed a €500 banger on the side.
Yeah, I can speed this one up, Sam, because I think it's almost a car chat standard response here. I'm afraid it's going to be it's going to be a 911. I think probably 991. But pretty bog spec. I'm not going to go for any crazy B-winged thing, because 911s, I think. The basic vanilla one is often the one to have. So yeah, that's my baby. 991.
Nice.
Yeah,
I think that's a good option. I think I'm slowly coming round to the not base spec as in like you don't have a sound system and stuff like that, but the lower spec models, because of all the things we talked about: ride quality, comfort, general usage, etc. I think there's a lot of value in the less crazy ones. What do you think is the most undervalued car?
I was going to say my 500-pound beater, by the way, is a Micra K10. That's no other answer possible.
Oh, nice.
That's your
Perfect. Most undervalued car at the moment. What should we work on?
A little bit of a niche one here for the Alpine fans out there. So, I love the A110, the modern one. Love the older one, the famous Berlinette, right, that inspired the A110. But I think a genuinely undervalued car out there is the A3110. So the 3110 folks might not know. You might have to Google it, but it's the kind of wedgy car that replaced the Berlinette in the early 70s, ran through the 70s. It was actually really successful. They sold a bunch of them in Germany, and they're cheap as chips at the moment. I think they're a genuinely good investment. They're a bit of a cool 70s wedge design. There you go. Yeah. So I think that's a bit of a keeper.
Yeah, I think those that sort of boxy shape is really coming into its own now. I think at the time, and I've said this on the podcast before, but if all the cars on the road look the same and you're all boxy cars, then everything just blends in and it doesn't necessarily look like super cool. When you see these shapes in modern traffic or amongst modern shapes, they stand out and they look seriously cool.
Yeah. And also, I love that car because it was designed straight after the original A110, which is all organic, smooth shapes, etc. And it was the same guys. It was the same design studio. It was Jean Rédélé, the guy who founded Alpine, who oversaw the design of it. And such a radical departure. They went crazy with that car, and you can pick them up pretty cheaply. The mechanicals are all simple. It's all standard Renault stuff that you can replace pretty easily. So I think they're a really cool car, undervalued, underknown. So all the A3110 owners out there now are going to be going, yes.
Yeah. Oh, I've just, before we get to the last two questions, I've realised that I've not brought up this, which so for the people listening, Dave sent me a book. Unfortunately, I haven't really had much time to read it because it only arrived about a day ago. But you've got a book out at the moment. Just tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, we've covered quite a lot of it actually, Sam, in between the different questions. Not so much about autonomous driving, but listen, the idea for it was, I thought of all the car enthusiasts I know and folks who are interested in cars. Everyone I know basically has some interest in cars, but people don't really know kind of where they come from, how they come into being. So, and if they do, they generally have some knowledge about the work of car designers, right, or car stylists, as we used to call them in the old days. So, the creative folks who come up with the shapes of the cars. But they don't really know about the work of engineering them and building them in the factory and the industrial side of things. So I thought, hey, I know that world. I love that world, so I'll write about it. So it's really kind of an explanation of where cars come from. And, they say you should only write about what you know. So I decided to base it on 3 projects I know very well. We've touched on them all, right? The Qashqai, the ZOE, and finishing up with the Alpine A110. So, check it out if folks want to know a little bit about what goes on in the kind of backstage of the industry.
Yeah. I'm interested to have a read. I will definitely get around to that at some point in time. Right, most interesting car to you at the moment?
Hey, by coincidence, it came up several times in our conversation, as it happens. The Lucid Air. So we talked about it a couple of times, but you brought it up, Sam. I didn't, but I am genuinely fascinated at the moment about this question of electric vehicle efficiency. And actually, quite a lot of the work I do as a freelance engineer is on that topic. So I found myself Googling the Air and getting into how they've worked on the powertrain, the packaging. So it is an extremely efficient vehicle from two viewpoints. One is the electrical efficiency, but also the packaging efficiency. It's a big car, but it's got enormous size inside it. So that's a very interesting car for me. I've been sort of skulking on all the various websites, and I'm quite interested in that car and quite impressed by it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing one. I don't know when I'm going to see one, but at some point. And see how these sort of companies evolve, and what they're going to make, and if they start off with something like that, like it bodes well for the future, I think.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I mean, they have a long path ahead of them. They've only just gone into startup production. They've got to deal with all the supply chain stuff and all the teething problems, the production nightmare, like Elon Musk once said. So they've got a long way ahead of them. But yeah, they're going to be an interesting company to watch. And the interior design as well, I would say, is extremely interesting. I've not driven one yet, but I've been lucky enough to sit in one and have a good poke around it. And it's when you sit into it, it's a very different experience to other sort of luxury cars. They genuinely tried to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to from all manufacturers. Really, is embracing the EV powertrain and going, we don't have to do stuff the same, because generally things are packaged around various stuff, of which some are still going to be there, steering wheel, whatever. But like, we're not tied to all of the old ways of doing it. So let's do the stuff you can do, and change what cars are like.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I don't want to, it'll be interesting when you get a chance to sit in one and drive one. But again, I don't think they've done stuff differently just for the sake of being different. Going back to the conversation we had about, peak screen, they haven't done stuff weird just to be different. You will find some physical buttons in there for things that should be physical buttons, but it is different, and it feels different. It feels different to an S-Class. It feels different to a BMW. It feels different to a Tesla S. So yeah, I like it a lot, and be interesting to see when it comes to the UK and folks get to drive it in the UK, if it feels very different here than it does in California. That might be tricky, because it is big, it is wide.
Yeah, and then, as we said, those cars, wide works in the States because they have tons more space. Right. Final question. You know what it is? 5-car garage.
All right.
Unlimited value.
I'm going to rattle through this. This one always made me smile the first time I heard your podcast, Sam, because I've played this game since I was a kid with my dad. This was what we did to while away long time journeys. But back then we used to have 10-car garage, and that was already bloody hard to choose 10. So choosing 5 is impossible. So I'm going to rattle through them real quick. So my 10-car garage to start up has 5 911s in it of different flavors. It's true.
I like that.
So my 5-car garage only has 2 911s. So let's get them out the way first. So the first one is a car I actually have in my garage at the moment, the same one. So I have a 911 SC. It's a little bit backdated, a little bit lightweight. Yeah. I love it. It's nice. A great compromise of all 911s. It's light, it dances, it's got narrow tires, but it's got enough power to get you into trouble. So okay, that's in there.
Yeah.
The second one, I really had trouble deciding between something really crazy like a 911 GT2 RS, but in the end, I came down for it's got to be a 991.2 GT3. It's
Torque or wing?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm a sucker for the wing. I'm a bit of a show off. I'd keep the wing. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
But yeah, it's got to be pretty close to peak 911, and I love them. But yeah, I'm enough of a show off to keep the wing, I'm afraid.
Yeah, fair. I think 2 good choices. So you got 3 more.
All right, so I guess I'll have to put one in there that I've actually done myself. So I'm going to pack a little Alpine A110 in there.
Yeah.
Base spec, your A110 is a little bit like a 911. You want as few toys as possible. So the 17-inch wheels, simple seats, simple color. I tick the sports exhaust because it makes a nice noise, but simpler the better when it comes to A110s. So that would be packed in there.
Cool.
Next up is I actually, this comes from my dad as well. I've got a soft spot for pre-war cars. I mean, pre-World War II. So I grew up with 70s, 80s, 90s stuff, but I like my proper old cars. So I'm going to go for this is completely fantasy land. I'm going to go for a Bentley 4.5 liter. So late 1920s. These are the cars that dominated Le Mans at the time. It's the fastest lorry in the world, as it was known as. great hulking things, the Bentley boys and all that good stuff. So I'd have one of those parked in the very large garage because they're enormous things. They're
Yes, that would be cool. Was that 5? We've got
no, I've got one left. So my last one, I thought of all of that. Okay, all that's good, but damn, I need a daily driver because they're all pretty, they're not very practical. So I thought, okay, I need something 4-seaters, something with a little bit of boot space that I could just run around in, and it's going to be a Nissan GTR R34, not the R35. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool GTR guy, so it's got to be a straight 6. So yeah, Nissan GTR R34 is the 5th one. Nice.
I like them. I like all GTRs actually, and I think they're starting to go there, but everyone is this sort of generation of almost like PlayStation cars, kind of, brought in by stuff like that. It's really starting to go up and up and up and up. The special ones are just going up and up and up in value, and matching the sort of Italian Exotica and whatever.
Oh, I had a quick Google of R34s. So, what if actually, especially the rare ones like the Nismo variants or anything that's a V-spec, they're strong money now, but they're fantastic things. Having spent the entire podcast, Sam, talking about the benefits of lightweight and small cars, nimble, etc., I'm going for like a big JDM bruiser, but hey, I like them.
Yeah, they're cool. I don't think anyone would disagree with that statement, but yeah. Right, well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Sam. It's been a long time. Been, as I said, listening a long time, so it's been really nice to be on the other side. And yeah, if you ever want to come back, we'll do an in-depth dive into autonomous and semi-autonomous driving. We can do an entire series on that if you want.
I would like to do that at some point. I think there's so many things to sort of unpack in that space. But yeah, another conversation for another time.
For sure.